Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Welcome to Fish University. Many of our listeners are probably private pond owners and enjoy it when we cover topics on small impoundment management. Well, today's topic was suggested by one of our listeners, and I liked the topic a lot and decided to jump at the chance to discuss it. Remember, you can always message me on Fish University Facebook page or send me an email and give me suggestions, questions, or comments at any time. Today's topic goes back to our theme of growing big bass. And if you're a bass angler, you know the biggest fish are always female. Fish managers know this as well and are taking advantage of the fact to try to grow trophy bass by only stocking fish with trophy potential. In other words, they're trying to establish all female populations. My guest today is a senior fisheries biologist with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources and someone who's been leading trials on these experimental stockings, Tim Bonvechio. Tim, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Wes. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, I hope your weather's a little bit better than ours. We just got off this hard freeze, and now we've got rain, I think, for the next 3 or 4 days in a row.
Yeah, same deal. We're a lot of cold weather in the 20s, and I think we're expecting 80 degrees on Thursday. So that might confuse the fish a little.
That's winter in the South, right? So, yeah. Well, Tim, welcome. You've been doing a lot of work with all female populations in Georgia, but tell us a little bit about your background, how you found your way into fisheries management and how you got on this career path.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I received my Bachelor of Science in Natural Resource Conservation from the University of Florida in 2000. It was a hogwash of forestry, wildlife, and fisheries classes. At the time, I wanted to be a teacher. I liked playing football and baseball in high school, and I thought maybe I'd be a teacher. So that's why I went after my BS. But I took this Intro to Fisheries class in my undergrad, and that got me hooked. I received my Master's in Fisheries Management also from UF in 2003. So everything in my life came full circle in the last year of my undergrad work when I took this Intro to Fisheries class in the spring of 2000. Now I'm dating myself. But this involved electrofishing on Lake Alice, which is a lake on campus there at the University of Florida. And then at the end of the semester, we had a management plan we had to write up. But I was hooked from that point on. When I got on the front of that stock boat, I said, man, you get paid to do this? It just fired me up. But I hooked up with a technician there, and her roommate, Beth Sargent, said that, well, my roommate's working on this block net project on Lake Kissimmee using block nets and rope known and looking at a habitat restoration project. This professor, Mike Allen, was working on it. So I volunteered on the project that summer and ended up being this graduate student was Kimberly Tugin, who was under the direction of Mike Allen and a young fisheries management professor at the time, just about 4 years into his work at the University of Florida. Anyway, I must have won both of them over, both people, because my work ethic and maybe a little charm, because Mike invited me into his lab the rest of the summer as a technician, and Kim and I started dating, and then 4 years later we were married, and now 23 and a half years later, married and have two wonderful children, Hannah and Lily. They're both teenage girls now.
And Kim's a fisheries biologist as well. Now, you're with Georgia. Isn't Kim she's with Florida, correct? So you guys must live right on the border.
Yeah, it's kind of Florida-Georgia line makeup. We've made it work for this long, and actually, Florida's sending her back to school. She's getting her PhD. She's halfway through it under Dr. Carlson at UF. So she's working on her work. Most of it has to do pretty much with the standardized sampling that she'd been working on in Florida FWC for 20 years. So really cool, unique opportunity for Kim. And she wanted to brush up. She's kind of their biometrician. So she got to brush up on her stats and it's kind of a bucket list thing. I mean, for a PhD, that's what she wanted to do. But I think really to brush up on her skills and become a lot better at analyzing data. So it's kind of a win-win for both.
Tim, tell us about what you do with Georgia DNR, your typical responsibilities that you do on a day-to-day basis.
As of today, I just found out who my new supervisor is. For my whole career here with Georgia DNR, over 17 years, Bert Diener was my supervisor. He just retired, and Don Harrison has taken over as the regional supervisor in Region 4 here in Fisheries. But I'll assume will resume the duties as the assistant. But as of right now, I'm going to have to play double roles. But right now, I'm in charge of fisheries management and budget operations on 3 public fishing areas. It's Dodge Public Fishing Area, Hugh Gillis PFA, and Ocmulgee PFA, the female-only fishery we'll talk about later here, as well as several county lakes, small impoundments, Dunn's Lake, Lindsay, Grace, Mayors, and several state park lakes. Also, I'm in charge of the Coney River from Dublin down to the confluence where it meets the Ocmulgee and Altamaha rivers. I help with special projects. We just recently completed a huge project on the Swanee bass, which is a rare and endemic black bass species only found in Florida and Georgia, where I've worked all my life. I've been very fortunate to work a lot on Swanee bass. And we just finished a study with the University of Georgia with Dr. Marty Hamill on movement and exploitation. The movement study has already been published, and exploitation should be out very soon too as well. The movement study is in hydrobiologia. I think it was published in September, and exploitation should be out this month in North American. But my responsibilities will change real soon here. I'm going to be in charge of a hatchery and a larger, more comprehensive public fishing area paradise that has a lot more lakes and things on it. So hopefully a different transition. But for now, I'm running both ships until we hire another biologist.
Yeah, you mentioned the Swanee bass. We had Steve Salmons on as a guest a while back when we talked about all the different bass species that are out there. And Georgia seems to be a hot spot for a lot of different black bass species.
Yeah, so we have that slam. If you look on our website, 10 black bass. We actually have more than that. I mean, the average angler can't tell between a Bama and a Kentucky spot, and also between a Florida and a largemouth. We have both, depending on where you look in the state, and an intergrade as well. And I'm sure we'll get more into genes here in a minute with the female-only stuff. But yeah, so we have 10 species. But the Swanee, believe it or not, is one that hasn't been affected, thank the good Lord, from introgression. They sympatrically coexist with the largemouth or Florida largemouth in Florida-Georgia line there, and that's it. There hasn't been. Don't bring a spotted bass near my river, please. Because they've even gotten into the Flint, unfortunately, and are threatening our shoal bass, which we've been stocking a lot to keep that introgression down, unfortunately. But there's some success stories out there. The Guadalupe has been turned around out in Texas from smallmouth, I believe.
Yeah, we talked about that one as well, and they've actually recovered that. The weather, I think, played a role in that. But
yeah. And the shoal bass has a lot of that opportunity. That river gets really low sometimes, and you can isolate and get rid of some of the spots that are in there and try to restock back with shoal bass, and we've done a lot of that.
Today we're going to talk about some of the work you've been doing on some of the smaller lakes, particularly where you're trying to manage for trophy largemouth bass. And when we say largemouth bass, I don't know if these are these Florida bass, these are northern bass, or are these a mixture of the two?
What makes trophy fish, growing season, age, genetics, food, all those things. The new lake, because of productivity and habitat. Our world record bass was produced in central Georgia, George Perry's fish. They have an excellent growing season. What are the genetics of the Ocmulgee River strain where that Montgomery Lake was? It's in the 85 to 90% range. It's a high intergrade is what we'd call it. I think most of the lumpers and splitters, and if you talk in the Peatman Lab in Auburn, 95 and up, they call it Florida bass as far as the genetics go. I think Georgia offers this excellent growing season and relatively mild winters most of the time. Longevity, I'm sure, plays it into growing trophies. I've aged largemouth bass up to 14 years in Georgia, and Kingsley Lake in Florida bios have aged fish up to 16. I know up in New York they've aged them into the 20s, but so longevity is that perfect medium, of both. But then I'll talk later on, and sometimes rapid growth rate. So there seems to be a lot of different ways to get too big as far as the growth curves can really vary a lot. I think genetics helps. Like I was saying, the world record strain from the Ocmulgee River is in that 85 to 90% range, depending on where you look at the river. It seems like we have more of a Florida strain further down as you get into the coastal Altamaha drainage. As you work further north, you have a little bit more of a higher northern allele effect. But as you work south, you get a higher Florida. We have pure Florida populations most folks don't know in South Georgia and Lake Park, Valdosta area that are 100%. So certainly, I think as far as stocking females, we put our finger on a lower density of 10 to 15 bass per acre. It keeps plenty of food in the lake for the bass, and especially as they get really big. We've tinkered with that issue, with that recipe as far as I'll talk about Ocmulgee 1.0 and 2.0 and what happened and what we had going on there. But we've tinkered with the recipe some. I went with a little higher recipe the second go around. I don't think the food base lasted as long as the densities got higher. And then we'll talk about males getting in as well. But a variety of native food is recommended, forage for the lake. I had a newspaper journalist call our recipe for forage the Jurassic Park approach. So I thought that was kind of funny. There's bluegill. We stock a lot of native bluegill in the lake. It does have white crappie in Ocmulgee PFA. It's a 106-acre lake. Golden shiners, lake chubsuckers, which I call the trout of the south, Eurymizon cicada. I really think that was a big ticket item early on in the densities when the lake got flooded and I stocked the lake with those. They were everywhere, but from what I've seen, they don't take a lot of bass predation pressure, and that's what the literature says. I think when the densities start getting above 15 per acre, you just don't see them unless you can keep your lake weedy, and most fishery managers don't like a hugely weedy lake. We put threadfin shad in the lake as well. Initially, we did not put gizzard shad in either recipe, one or two, but then later on, as we saw what it looked like, the growth rates and the peak of the lake in the second time, gizzard shad were added to the mix. And we have seen some reproduction, but I think the jury's out on that. We might have been a little bit late on the curve there. We did goldfish for a while, but no longer keep those at the hatchery because we just consider stocking native fish our main goals and priorities. Some have argued the goldfish may have helped with keeping the male densities down and the recruitment in the Ocmulgee 1 to Ocmulgee 2. So that's something you may want to keep in mind. But I'm not advocating a non-native to be stocked. Hatchery guys are able to produce a lot of tonnage and poundage of those goldfish. They're easy to grow, and so that's kind of why we went that route initially. But now we grow all native fish and stock in there, and we've tinkered with that lake chubsucker recipe and done a really good job with that. They're weird. One year you'll get pretty good fecundity and good offspring, and the next year not as good. So I'm not sure what it is. I don't know if it's otters getting in our brood ponds and ruining the reproduction or what. But anyway, yeah, I think that probably answers that question.
Yeah, and you covered a lot there. Let's sort of unpack it a little bit. You know, what you hit on there, you kind of hit on all four things that go into growing a trophy fish. I mean, you mentioned growing season. Fish are cold-blooded. Fish, they grow faster when when the water temperatures are optimal, and then they grow slower when they're too cold or too hot. And with growing season, one of the things I did in my PhD was look at largemouth bass maximum size versus latitude. And what we found was when you plot the record bass and what latitude it's caught at, that if you think about a hill, on the left side of the hill, that's Canada and New York. And on the right side of the hill, that's the tropics where bass aren't native. And where it peaks out, that's right there about where the world record was caught in Georgia, which is 32 degrees latitude, something like that?
Yeah, I don't quote me on the exact number. But
If you look at the biggest fish, I mean, yeah, sure, there's some anomalies, the anomalies being Japan and California, but those places are affected by the ocean. The ocean currents modify the climate. We call California is considered a Mediterranean climate because it's really far north, but it gets the ocean keeps the climate regulated. But everywhere else, you can usually set the largemouth bass size by the latitude in which you're fishing.
Yeah, they were also introduced in California, and you're throwing a lot of trout in there. So that's some of that. But, something most people don't know, the fish that were moved out to California weren't very high Florida alleles. So that's kind of interesting in itself. We know that gene's been isolated, and they're looking at it. We know the Florida gene definitely helps with maximum size, but even the Sherlunker progeny out in Texas, they're taking FX as intergrades too now, not just Florida's, because I think there's something to that. It isn't just the pure Florida that intergrade. And you'll see in some of the work we've done here, some of those high intergrades are pumping out some really big fish.
It's hybrid vigor, possibly, where you take two species, and they're considered separate species now, and you cross them, that sometimes you get the best of both worlds. But so genetics, you mentioned the second one. Genetics is the second one, and usually if you're in a farm pond, you can stock it with the genetics you want, but once you've got the genetics out there, there's not a whole lot you can do to manage genetics, except for what we're talking about today, which is one specific part of the genetics, which is gender or sex of the fish. We'll get back to that in a second. Then the other two things, you mentioned longevity. Obviously, just like with trophy bucks, the older an animal is, the longer it has to grow, and fish have indeterminate growth. So, they can grow and grow and grow forever, whereas a buck hits a peak and then goes downhill. And then the last one being food. And I always tell people food's the most important. A way to a trophy bass is through its stomach. And you've talked about all kinds of different foods, gizzard shad, lake chub suckers, goldfish, and so forth. All of that's a way to make it easy for those fish to get a smorgasbord of food. Goldfish, and one of the great things about goldfish, in addition to how easy they are to produce in the hatchery, is how easy they are for a bass to see and catch. So, so those four factors go into growing a big fish. But today we want to talk about specifically all females. So we're really talking about a specific component of genetics, which is the gender of the fish. Why is it that an all-female population is desirable?
When I used to work for Florida Fish and Wildlife for 3 years after grad school, before I moved up here with Georgia for 17. We worked on the Kissimmee chain a bunch and threw some data together in 2006. Randy Myers and I and Mike Allen and a few other Texas Parks and Wildlife guys. And we saw that catch and release ethic had gone through the roof compared to what it used to be on some of those big lakes, the Kissimmee chain of lakes and Texas lakes. So thanks to Ray Scott, with the catch and release ethic has gone through the roof and in the past few decades. And people don't kill bass, you probably tie it to certain areas where people are still harvesting fish, maybe socio-demographic areas where people want to just eat fish to eat. But in general, if you can afford a bass boat, people are catch and release, and it's just really taking a kind of a tool out of our tackle box, so to speak. We can't use harvest much anymore. So this caters to that person. If you can keep the densities low, catch and release ethic, then that could be a really advantageous thing. And also, we don't know if this is true or not, but I think if they're not spawning, they're not allocating all that energy towards spawning, so they reabsorb those eggs. And so it's not towards reproduction. So certainly I think that helps their growth potential.
Exactly. So, really there's about three different things going on. One is you have just greater trophy potential because females get bigger than males. Mm-hmm. Two is you don't get reproduction. So you can control population size and manage for maximum or basically unlimited food.
Yeah.
And three, you don't have that competition between males, which are eating up half the food that the females don't get. So it's a way to control recruitment and essentially double the number of fish that have trophy potential. Whereas if you've got half males, half females, half those fish just don't have trophy potential. I think one of my first podcasts was on the Sherlunker program, and we talked about that. And I think they said that the biggest fish they've ever handled that was a male was right at 8 pounds. That's an anomaly. I tell people generally, you're not going to catch a bass bigger than about 5 pounds if it's a male.
I saw one 7-pounder in Kissimmee chain, but 5 or 6 pounds is pretty common max for males.
So if you're looking for double-digit fish, males just will never get there. So why have them in the first place? And
Yeah.
that's really what people are thinking. If you can control the gender of the fish or the sex of the fish, then why not maximize growth potential and control recruitment at the same time? And what you mentioned about the reproduction, well, every time fish can allocate the energy they get from food to two things. They can put it towards growth or they can put it towards reproduction.
Yep.
Female fish in an all-female population certainly will still develop gametes in the springtime, and they'll put on 2 or 3 pounds of egg weight. But if they're not actually releasing those eggs with a male, then it's believed those eggs are resorbed, and that energy stays with the fish versus being lost to the environment essentially. So that's another benefit to it as well.
Yeah, I think you'll see later on our growth rates definitely early on where the males hadn't gotten in there much. Some of the biggest fish I doubt were spawning because there wasn't many males in there for them to spawn. And yeah, I think they just allocate their growth back, reabsorb them, like you said.
We're talking about this as, this is a great technique if you have the ability to control the sex of the fish that go out into the water body. It doesn't mean that that's the only thing you can do. You still need to monitor water quality, maintain fertility, make sure you have adequate habitat for the fish. And certainly, we've got to manage prey populations so that there's plenty to go around and plenty of food to eat. But it's just one tool in the toolbox.
Yeah, absolutely. We manage the lake for maximum productivity with lime when needed or fertilizer when needed during the growing season to keep a good bloom, add fish attractors and habitat and supplemental prey. We do not that the lake needs more bluegill or golden shiners, lake chubsters, but we're trying to keep it loaded to the brim for, to maximize growth potential.
Yeah, the less energy the bass needs to exert to catch it. If it just opens its mouth and prey swim in, it's going to grow bigger than if it has to work for it, right?
Yeah, right.
But let's talk about what I think is probably the most complicated part of this equation, which is where do we get all female fish? Because it seems like a pretty easy thing to do. Where I can just go out and I can collect fish from the pond, and the ones that are males I'll throw back, and the ones that are females I'll take and stock in this new lake. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. First of all, sorting fish is a pain in the butt. It takes a lot of time. It's not that easy to tell a male and a female apart when they're smaller. But the other thing, when they're big enough to determine whether they're male or female for a professional who can tell them apart most of the time, there's always a possibility to make a mistake. It's very easy to make a mistake and say, I'm pretty sure this one's a girl, but it's not. It's a guy, it's a boy, and one male is all it takes. But the other thing is, by the time they're mature and you can tell them apart, a lot of times it seems that they become set in their ways. And when you take an adult fish from one lake and move it to another lake, it may not know how to make its living. And one of my favorite stories is when I had Bob Lusk on here, and Bob said, he told me a story about this older gentleman that wanted to build a lake and wanted to stock it with so many 10-pound fish because he was 70-something years old, and his quote was, I don't buy green bananas because I might not be here when they're ripe. Well, they stocked, I think, a 12-pounder in the lake, and the guy never caught it, and they electrofished it once or twice, and I think the second time it weighed 9 or 8 pounds. Because that bass came from another lake, it became a 12-pounder in that lake, and then when it was put in this new water body, it didn't know how to thrive like that. So moving adult fish oftentimes just doesn't work from that standpoint.
We've tinkered with this a lot in our hatcheries. The fish are grown out in different size ponds, but typical 1 acre pond at an acre basis, we've messed with around 100 to 120 bass per acre. So that's not a lot of bass being stocked at 2 inches, several weeks old, a couple months old. Anyway, 25 to 50 millimeters restocked back out in the pond for a year at 100 to 120 bass per acre. Now, we've messed with the recipe of what we put in these ponds for forage as well. We know we have to keep the bluegill small because they'll eat all the bass when you stock them in. You don't want bluegill more than 3 to 5 inches long as your brood bluegill in the pond because they'll eat what you're stocking if they're 7, 8 inches. And then your survival of your pond is 50%, and that doesn't help you when you're trying to shoot for so many females because you also have to half that because half of these are going to be males you're feeding for the year as well. But so 100 to 120 bass per acre, and with the goal of the bass getting to 10 inches long. And that's in 10 to 12 months later. We use a glass pipette and insert it in that urogenital port, and it won't go up the male. Typically, these fish that are 10 inches long do express. A lot of the males express milk, that's obvious. And the females, you stick that genital and you get eggs out, that urogenital port out, and you get eggs. That fish goes on the trailer. I would agree with you, it's not 100%. When I did it, we didn't have a lot of people doing it until they were well trained, so it's slow, it's time consuming. There's days when we have a harvest like this, it'd take me all day to do that many fish and then, haul them to the lake. We pit tagged them all. I'll talk about that later on. There's a reason we pit tag all the females. You can track growth without killing them. How awesome is that? We wanted to get them a good head start. They're only 10 to 12 months old when we stock them in the pond. Yes, they got forage soup in those hatchery ponds, and hopefully the idea is when you stock them in the main lake, you've got forage soup still in there, and they convert over pretty easily. That's the idea. They're not pellet raised; they're fish trained. We've messed with all threadfin shad ponds at the hatchery and bluegill ponds at the hatchery, a combination of bluegill, shell cracker, things like that. We've messed with a bunch of different forage or a threadfin bluegill combination. They all the combinations can grow bass that big in a year, but they're easy to sex if you get them 10 inches or higher. 8, 9, borderline. Since I've done a lot of them, I can do some 9s, but I prefer 10 to 11s, and we've seen them to 14 inches in their first year, and that's crazy.
And you guys are trained fisheries professionals, and you know the technique. But the average pond owner, if they want to move fish, and they just look at the fish, you just can't look at a male bass and a female bass unless they're in the middle of spawning.
I'm not denying that we didn't stick a few males in there, but unfortunately, the main thing was a 7-acre pond in the upper drainage that kind of hurt the recipe this time around.
And we'll get to that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But there are some other ways to do it. One of which is the way that can be done for research purposes is what we call sex reversal. And that's as simple as taking a new batch of fry and hitting them with either a male hormone or a female hormone and causing them to switch. That's not legal for stocking into public waters because it's not an FDA approved approach. But what is legal, if this ever becomes a trend with private lakes and hatcheries begin producing all female fish, is something called gynogenesis, which is you do that sex reversal with hormones. You take a female, which is XX, and you reverse it to become a male, so it still has XX chromosomes, but it produces milk like a male, and you breed that to a normal female, and you should get all XX offspring or all female offspring. That would be legal to stock, and that's being done with tilapia and a few other species, but I don't know that's being done anywhere in the private sector for private pond stocking yet. But that would be another way to get around the idea for fisheries management in private waters. But if someone's telling you they're selling you all female fish from a private hatchery, you might want to get a second opinion just because, you've heard how time consuming it is to figure out these fish, especially if they're little fish.
Yeah, if they're little, there's probably no way they're giving you all females. But we haven't tinkered with any of those other methods you were talking about. In general, that's what we presumed, though, that if you grew these fish out, they're getting a really good start, and then you throw them in the pond. And there's some interesting caveats to that, and I'll show you kind of when we get into the stocking history a little bit.
Yeah, and you're getting them in at a fairly small size, so they have time to adapt to the new water body.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at wes, that's WES, .neal, that's NEAL, at Mississippi State, that's MSSTATE, .edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show.
Let's go ahead and move on to one of your actual lakes. Tell us about how you prepped it and stocked it and the stocking density for the lake.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about Ocmulgee Public Fishing Area. It's 106 acres. I'm going to refer to Ocmulgee 1.0 and 2.0 because we've had two life histories of this lake now. Ocmulgee 1.0 was initially stocked with age 1 female bass in 2005. Between 5 and 12, it got up to 15.9 bass per acre total. That's through 7 years, which isn't that high. And in 2012, which was 7 years in, angler catch rates were 7.35 hour to catch an 8-pound bass. That's really phenomenal. But there were some things going on in 12. The water level started dropping due to a leak in the lake. We had a sinkhole in the lake, unfortunately, but catch rates were really good. It was like fishing in a bathtub. And so basically, if you fished 8 hours, you could catch an 8-pounder. Growth was really fast. They reached 18 and 20 inches in 2.59 and 3.69 years. So pretty fast growth rates, despite males getting in Ocmulgee 1.0 fairly early. When we drained that lake in 12, it's still outnumbered. There was 6.9 females to every one male, the ratio of the number of fish in there when we removed what we could remove out. So the density of males stayed down the first go round. That recipe designed to stock females appeared to be a viable path to keep the densities low and produced a high number of trophy bass. Like we said, that strategy accommodated anglers that have a high catch rate. They like to catch fish, but catch and release ethic. And it produced, largemouth bass population with a low recruitment and fast growth without requiring high harvest. We did write this up in SIFWA 2016. It's myself and Joe Rydell who started that recipe before I came on. Joe's a biologist with Nebraska now. But you can look that up in 2016 in SIFWA. And I also want to mention Dr. Messina's paper on the female-only recipe. He's got one out there with Ron Phelps and Steve Salmons as well. So there's a couple of papers in the literature. This first recipe, they did stock F1s initially in Ocmulgee for the first 2 years, and then intergrades after that. I think the lake record was a little over 13, but that was a fish that was shocked. I electrofished that fish up in the first go round. Several anglers caught 11 and 12 pounders first go round. But then we go to Ocmulgee 2.0. When the lake was shut down in the fall of 2012, when a sinkhole developed and we had the lake fixed, it sat empty for 4 years until we could get it fixed. And so we had a lot of trees growing up in it, pine trees growing up in it. So we got 4 years of growth around the edges of where, that lake used to be limed and fertilized. So it was just like a new renovation again, really. They did have to fix a 20-acre footprint down the middle. The leak was developed along the river bottom, basically, in the creek, a 22-acre footprint. So now we're into Ocmulgee 2.0. We stocked from 2016 to 2023, a total of 22 bass per acre. I was planning on stopping at 15 to 20 per acre in that range, probably into 20 per acre, a little bit more fish this time, this go around. But we found males in the lake and recruitment started to increase. And then I got the males tested from the pond. The private owner let me test the fish, and they were from the upper pond where I presume the males were getting in. And they were in the 50% allele percentage. What we were stocking the second go round was a Georgia intergrade and the Georgia Florida bass, basically. Anywhere from 78 to 100% Florida alleles is what we stocked the second go round. We have a couple different strains in our hatcheries, but they're basically a high intergrade or a pure Florida is what we use in our state. Everything that's in Georgia waters, basically. So I did push the envelope a little more and put a few more fish in the lake because I felt like it was getting tainted with those 50%ers coming down. And those weren't F1s. They're just an intergrade that was in the pond for multiple generations, but the private landowner just didn't want to, he didn't want to have it renovated. But so what do we do? Do we trade off with more bass, or do we just look for the integrity of the genetics to go down? Well, we're probably north of 30 bass per acre in the lake now, if you count the recruitment I'm seeing in the lake. So We saw similar growth rates in both recipes, no matter what genes you're talking about. But let's talk about the second go round here. In 19, which was essentially, we had year classes in there that were up to 4 years old now. The first year classes we put in 2017, we put in some 2-year-olds that were held over in a pond that were 2015 year class fish. And we also put there was 100 of those, or 51 of those, ended up, that was what was left after another year. And then we put 500 of 2016 year class fish in. Interestingly enough, the lake record and some of the really big fish were the ones that were 1 year old when we put them in, not 2. The 2-year-olds didn't do as good, which is kind of credence to what you were talking about before. As they're an adult, they may not do quite as good. But we did end up getting some 10-pounders out of those first initial year class. But really, we stocked 2 years in the first class, if you know what I mean. But we did shock a 9-pound bass in 2019 that was 3 years old, and several 7 and 8 pounders, which leads me to a 2020 fish we electrofished. It came from the Ocmulgee River strain, Dodge County PFA, which is one of the other PFAs I help manage, at 85% Florida alleles progeny. This fish was stocked on February 5th of 2017 as an 11-month-old bass. It was 285 millimeters, so 11 inches, 335 grams. It was 3/4 of a pound when it was stocked from the Richmond Hill hatchery, which is where we were keeping the Dodge County broods, or roughly 85% Florida alleles. When we stocked that fish, I pit tagged it, so I had the number of the pit tag. We recaptured that fish as a 3-year-old. It was 7.82 pounds. So it went from 3/4 of a pound as a 1-year-old to 7.82 as a 3-year-old in 19. And then we recaptured the fish a year later, the same time in the springtime, February 19th of 2020, as a 4-year-old. It was 609 millimeters and 5,900 grams, or 13 pounds. And it was a 4-year-old bass. And that was record growth. I don't think I've ever heard of a 4-year-old growing, but as a 3-year-old, it was 7, almost 8 pounds, and it grew over 5 pounds between a 3 and 4-year-old, and only a week difference within a year of when we shot the fish. You know, you can imagine what kind of reaction we had on Facebook when we posted that bass. 2,300 likes, 600 comments, and 1,500 plus shares. I mean, it was really a popular fish, and it accelerated the effort out there to catch big bass, and usage really went through the roof after we posted that fish on social media. So I would consider the lake a success. Average size, we ran a creel in 2022, which I actually think was past the peak of what we saw in the lake, but we were still getting 5-pound bass in 22. That was the average size bass caught in the lake. So, I mean, if you're happy with people catching a common 5.05 pound bass, but catch rates were much lower, the lake was full pool the second go round. We're talking 1.14 bass per hour. So, they fixed the sinkhole and no problems whatsoever with that. And the catch rates really dropped because, well, there's not that many bass. I don't know if the listeners know, but in an unfertilized lake, we usually put 50 bass per acre, and a fertilized 100 bass per acre, and that's mixed gender. And so I've only put a total of 22.9 bass per acre in this lake. Now, granted, with reproduction, I think it's well over 30 bass per acre now, but that's still going to end up being a low catch rate, especially if you have a high pressure, a lot of people fishing the lake. So that's one of the downsides to this. The cautionary tale is catch rates will be low in a low density female population. There's no way around it.
A lot of these bass fishermen, they like to fish all day for one bite, if that bite is potentially a double-digit fish, which is a question I had regarding the anglers, what they think. Do you allow any harvest at all, or is it completely catch and release?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, it is catch and release. One of the side anecdotes is you see in these, as a fisheries manager, with low density of predators in the lake, we put white crappie in there, and I do think the bass eat them, but they have also gone crazy in there, and it's a really good fishery for black crappie. The lake record's pushing almost 3 pounds, 2.9 or something like that. So some really nice crappie in there, but the bluegill stunt, believe it or not. And even if we feed them, we keep some grow pretty good size around the feeders. And the bass love to hang around the feeders, obviously, to eat the bluegill. They get up in size. But you do see a lot of stunted 2, 3, 4-inch max red ear and bluegill in the lake because of the low density of predators in the lake. So that's a cautionary tale. You don't want to manage the lake for sunfish if you're not going to have, it's typical swingle.
So if it's a mandatory catch and release on the bass, do the anglers accept the fact that when they catch potentially a fish of a lifetime, they have to release it?
I planned on that being an issue, because, if I caught a 13-pounder, I want to get it certified too. But so we put a catch and release cage on our floating dock that fluctuated with the water level, anticipating a lot of big fish, and put a hotline for the lake manager or myself or anybody. If we got a big fish, throw it in the cage. We'll get to it and we'll weigh and certify it for you. A lot of false alarms there. People catching 5-pounders saying they're 8 and vice versa. But we did have some nice fish. New lake record was caught through the whole lifetime of the lake. The lake record is 10 pounds, 10.56 ounces in 2020, which is not really as big as what we saw in electrofishing. In 2020, we had 4 bass I electrofished over 10 pounds, and anglers turned in 6 bass over 10 pounds. So in 2020, we saw a total of 10 bass, 10 unique bass. They're all pit tagged. They were different fish, 10 over 10 in 2020. And this is in a 100-acre lake. In 21, we electrofished 2 bass over 10 pounds and had 2 fish turned in. So that's 4 over 10 in 21. In 22, we electrofished 4 bass over 10 pounds and only 1 turned in. That was 5 over 10 in 22. So on and so forth. 23, we only had 1 bass we electrofished over 10 pounds and none turned in by anglers in 23 over 10 pounds. So between 20 and 23, we had 20 bass. They were unique. Well, actually, 1 was a recap that I'm going to talk about. Some nice bass going over 10 pounds. That doesn't count the number of 8s and 9s that we had scanned and turned in, which is an admirable fish itself. I was, aiming for the stars there, hoping for some really big double-digit fish with this recipe. The unfortunate thing is that we did electrofish that 13-pound bass that was 4 years old. We electrofished it 2 years later. It was 10.33 pounds. So it had a line hanging out of its mouth. It had obviously been gut hooked and broken off in the trees. So the fish lost weight. Still a trophy in most people's eyes at over 10 pounds as a 6-year-old, but broke my heart. I was hoping she was 18 by then, but anyway, so it appears that the lake had peaked, but for similar amount of time between Ocmulgee 1.0 and 2.0, we saw similar growth rates, but the males seem to have gotten in there faster this second go round than in the first go round. In my fall sample, 40% of what I electrofished is recruitment that did not have a pit tag in it. So I'd say the genie's completely out of the bottle now. But we were removing them every year, the recruitment that we saw, in the hopes that we could keep it in check.
So if you say you've peaked already and you're on the downhill slope, what does the future hold for this lake? Is this something you think you'll be renovating again in the not so distant future and starting over again? Or do you think that you'll just let it develop as more of a natural, typical fishery?
Probably, but like I mentioned before, my responsibilities are changing, so this one won't be falling in my hands fairly soon. So I don't know what they'll do, but if I had to guess, we're going to have to take off the catch and release and put some harvest on the population. It broke my heart, but it's still a really good fishery. Don't get me wrong. The creel last year, showed anybody can come out there and catch a 5-pounder on a regular basis is a nice fish. It's just the double-digit fish seem to have fallen off. And something I'll mention to the listeners and people tinkering with these recipes in the future, we saw a ton of lake chubsuckers in the first 2 to 3 years of our electrofishing out there, and they disappeared as the density of bass got higher in the lake. You just didn't see them. Now, I know the habitat starts to break down over time, but still, they got eaten up. As the density went from 10 to 20, 25 bass per acre, they disappeared, even with our substantial, subsequent stocking. Those things really help put it on the bass. And I think that absorption of eggs, I think that's why we saw a 4-year-old 13-pounder. We did have all the conditions right. Keeping a lake open 24/7 in a recipe like this, don't recommend that because of how much pressure was on the fish. And that brings me to my next thing we're going to talk about, all the different ones we have going in Georgia and what we have to look forward to in some of the other water bodies. We're still doing that in Silver Lake management, Panic Pond, they call it down on Silver Lake WMA. It's a 15-acre lake. And to my knowledge, they've not found a male in there, so they've been very good about stocking just females in there. It's a much smaller lake. Don't quote me, but I know they produce 10, 11-pound range as the max size. I don't know exactly what the lake record is, but they do close it in July and August, which I think is really important for this recipe to give the lake a break when it's the hottest times of the year. Most folks haven't caught an 8-pound bass, 8, 9, 10 pounds. They hold it out of water too long in the hottest time of the year. If you've ever seen some of the lures that are used, they're big, giant treble hooks, gut hook fish all the time, and they don't make it in the summer if they're held out of water, bleeding out the gills and deep hook. So that's a part of it. I mean, that's just part of it. That's fishing. Summertime, if you have the luxury, Silver Lake's cool on Panic Pond because there's multiple lakes on the area. So you can kind of tinker with a recipe like that. It's harder on a one-lake area to close it down, period, when people want to come fish the lake. But Silver Lake, that Panic Pond is open 3 days a week, Saturday through Monday. And they do allow some harvest for bass over 24 inches. One bass can be kept in there. A couple other recipes on Marvin PFA. They're currently renovating several lakes. Co-worker of mine, Brandon Baker. Greenhouse is a 5-acre lake. Clubhouse is 9, and Marjorie is 42 acres. So those 3 lakes are being renovated and are in the recipe for this female-only production. They're intensively managed just like ours, and basically just like the Mulgi one. But he's not sure about the regs yet on that one, but he would like to limit it some, at least in the summertime. But he's going to have the luxury of having, multiple lakes on the area. I didn't have that luxury at Mulgi because it's only one lake on that area, so kind of had to stay open 7 days a week.
Wasn't a current or previous state record caught out of Lake Marjorie at one point in time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Marjorie has a history of really big bass. I know they've had 2 fish in the top 5, a 17 and an 18-pounder. I think it might have been this number 2, that 18. I don't think there was a fish between that and George Perry's fish. So, yeah, really excited to see what Marjorie can do in a few years, and been talking with Brandon about what kind of densities he's going to put in there, and he's hoping to keep it closed for a while and get the forage really pumping before. And he's going to get chub suckers in there as well. So, it's neat. We can build. That's what science is all about, right? We can build on what we learned the first time and try to make it even better. So excited about those opportunities for sure.
Yeah, I mean, a lake that has a history like that, it's got the potential to grow fish. So by doing the all-female approach, it's just, one more added benefit to the lake to try to push it over the top. You might be looking at trying to break George Perry's record somewhere down the line, but having a much lower density, having abundant prey base and the right genetics out there, it seems to already be in the right location. I'm excited to see what that lake holds in, say, the next 6, 7, 8 years.
Yeah, and don't be surprised if the really big ones start coming up earlier than anticipated, I had heard of 10-pounders in 5 years in some Mississippi lakes that were renovated and restocked. That Colin Panther Lake out there in central Mississippi, another one that's in that right latitudinal line. I caught my personal best, actually, in Colin Panther Lake in Mississippi, a 12.5-pounder when I was out there fishing with my good buddy Porter Hall.
Yeah, in Mississippi, these smaller lakes, they have a recipe where they usually only let them go for about, 15 years or so before renovations, because a lake, when you first drain it, allow it to grow some vegetation, refill it, restock it, it goes through a boom period that, peak about 6, 7 years in, and then it starts to fall back off. And after about 15 years, it stabilizes at a much lower level. So you can either leave it the way it is, but what Mississippi chooses to do on these small lakes that are easier to manage is every 15 years or so, they choose to drain the lake, retool the bottom, refill, restock, lime, whatever it's necessary, because they're trying to maintain these lakes towards, near the peak.
You hit the nail on the head with the whole new lake effect. Definitely, that's going on. I've talked to the guys out in Texas, OH Ivy, and that lake, how much it's been booming. Little different deal there, although it's an old lake. It was really low, drought, and then everything grew up, mesquite bushes and everything, and then 10, 15 years down the road, it flooded again. And so it's like a new lake effect, really. And you see that in Florida lakes that have sinkholes that dry up and restart. Orange Lake's a great example in Florida, produces teeners, and that's the same deal. The sinkhole opens up, drains it, and then Florida stocks it with pure Floridas again, and then, they got 15 pounders again. So it's definitely a recipe. Renovating is, if you want to see your teeners, is the way I call them.
Yeah, and also in a small pond, this is kind of going on a tangent a bit, but if you're managing a 2-acre to a 5-acre, 10-acre lake, keep in mind that when you stock that pond, the largemouth bass that go in it are probably coming from the same hatchery. They may be offspring from the same couple of broodstock. So your genetics are limited to begin with, and then they breed with themselves through time. So starting over is putting new genetics in that have not been essentially diluted through inbreeding over the past 10, 15, 20 years. It's always a good idea, bring in some extra genetics. And what you said about OH Ivy with them, it's that vegetation. You get all that terrestrial vegetation grows up. That's nutrients. That's food for prey. And when it starts to decompose, the lake explodes. It's really productive for a while, but eventually that all gets used up, and there's no new terrestrial vegetation coming in. Yeah, we see that a lot.
Texas has that luxury of that, massive fluctuations, and they can turn into a hero pretty quickly. That Colorado River fluctuates a ton. So that's a really neat recipe for trophy bass for them.
Yeah, I wonder what people in Texas would say if they hear you call their drought cycle a luxury.
Well, if you think about it, and we've kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together in how to grow trophy bass. I do think that the bass and Ocmulgee were flying to El Infinite in 3-4 years pretty quick versus, say, like the guys that work down in Florida on that oligotrophic Lake Kingsley, that they're 16 years old before as they have aged bass. They're on a different growth curve. It takes a while for them to get to that, versus Ocmulgee. But that's the Von Berlimphy I was referring to with the El Infinite. But
the growth curve, yeah. For the folks that aren't fish biologists, these means they're growing at a super fast rate, and their maximum size potential's a lot higher. But you sort of talked about what's next for Georgia and some of these lakes, but I think we sort of covered it. But do you have any parting thoughts or anything else you want the audience to know? Or
completely off base, but I would like your user groups to hear. I've been working with a couple biologists, Marty Hamill with UGA and North Carolina biologist Kevin Dockendorf. I'm working on a standard weight equation for flyer. This is completely off of what we were just talking about. But I'm trying to data mine from 17 states where they exist, and some of these states I cannot find any data for, Mississippi being one of them. But if you pull up on iNaturalist, you can find people that are catching them everywhere. So I don't understand why I can't get any data. But if your listeners out there know that where they can get on some flyer, have them get a hold of me. I'm struggling in Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Alabama, and Louisiana, which is right in your neck of the woods. I've got plenty of data from all the other states, but for whatever reason, I'm struggling.
I'll try to turn over some stones for you. I know some people that might do some coastal sampling that have caught them. So,
it's not much of a fishery in some places, but in Georgia and North Carolina, we have them and people target them a lot. And so it's a fishery that we have no PSD groups and no relative weight equations to manage them. So trying to get that equation put out there for us managers. But I'd really like to incorporate all the states or most of them,
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. Well, thanks for coming on. I hope people have learned something about trying to do an all-female population. It's not easy to source the fish, but if you have the ability to sex fish that are small and put them into a small lake, you potentially could grow mostly all-female population. It's a great opportunity to grow bigger fish, especially if you want to control the recruitment and limit the number of fish out there so that there's more prey to go around. And it's probably not for every pond owner, but it might be for some.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I didn't mention before. You know, a common problem in small impoundment management is overpopulation of bass. And we just don't see that with a female-only fishery. You might get a little recruitment if males get in there, but it's a way you could start off upon, even if it does go male-female. You could start it off as females and try to grow a lake record, and then knowing that once if males get in there, then, well, you can just go to normal management. You know what I mean?
Go back to normal harvest recommendations, taking out 15 to 30 pounds of bass per acre and so forth, just like we've been preaching since the days of Swingle.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, thanks so much for being here. We do really appreciate you being on, and thanks everybody for listening to Fish University. We hope to see you here next time.
Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.